morning, everyone. My name is Jelena Gilliam, and I am a senior associate here at Scott Legal. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about a TN visa, what does it require, the sponsorship, and all the other requirements explained. We're going to be focusing on the TN visa, and today we are fortunate enough to have Dustin to help present that information to us. He has some experience navigating these types of visas at our firm. Just a few things before we get started. We're a full immigration firm. We handle business visas. We focus on visas such as the visas we're going to talk about today. We will continue this webinar series doing at least 2 a month on different topics. And at the end of today, we'll send out a few things, one being the PowerPoint that we are going to see today, as well as a link to where you can sign up for the additional webinars and our YouTube channel. There is a question. You can put your questions in the chat box so we can do a Q&A towards the end, and I'll be monitoring those for the end of the session. And then finally, the webinar will be recorded and available via email and our YouTube channel. So without further delay, Dustin, you are good to go.
Right. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Jelena. So as Jelena mentioned, we're going to be talking about the TN visa, which is one of the most popular visas at our firm. And there's a good reason for that. And that is if you have a passport from Mexico or Canada, then there are few easier options to come to the US to work. So we will be talking through what those requirements are for the TN visa, as well as some uniquely challenging areas of the TN visa. And as Jelena mentioned, we'll be monitoring questions, so please do send those in throughout the presentation. So let's start by talking about what the TN visa requirements are. So as I mentioned before, the TN visa requires that you hold a passport from either Canada or Mexico, and that is because the visa is rooted in NAFTA. So it is a treaty visa between the US, Canada, and Mexico. You do only need a passport, so you don't need to have been born in Canada or Mexico. So if, for example, you were born in India and you naturalized in Canada, if you have a Canadian passport, you are eligible for a TN visa. Now, you must be coming to the US to work in one of a number of listed professions. So there are dozens of professions that are listed. And the easiest way to find out what those are is to simply Google NAFTA, N-A-F-T-A, TN regulations. And when you pull up the regulations, you'll actually see a list of these occupations. So they start with accountant, then architect, computer systems analyst. They go down to social worker, urban planner. There are medical professions such as dentist, pharmacist, veterinarian, as well as scientist positions, biochemist, biologist, geologist, and teachers, college, seminary, or university teachers. So as you can tell, there are literally dozens of TN professions. You do need to be coming to the US to work in one of these listed professions. So not every profession is listed. So marketers unfortunately don't fall into a specific TN category. So that is one example of a profession that doesn't fit. And there, of course, are others. Even though there are dozens listed, some are not. So we'll talk about what that means for an application and how to navigate that later in the presentation. So you must have the required qualifications for the specific profession that you're coming to the US to perform. Okay, so going back to the regulations, just to take an example, you'll see for each listed occupation, there are specific requirements. For an accountant, for example, you need a baccalaureate degree or a licenciatura degree or a professional license. That could be a CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA. But so for accountant, you need a bachelor's degree or a professional license. Let's take another example. For an economist, you need a bachelor's degree. So you cannot come to the US to work as an economist if you only have a, say, professional license or work experience. If we look at management consultant is interesting because, as you can see, you can qualify based on a bachelor's degree or professional experience, at least 5 years of professional experience. So you see in those three examples several different bases for qualifying. You have a bachelor's degree for certain professions, a professional license for certain professions, or experience for certain professions. But you really do need to look at your specific profession that you're coming to the US to perform, and then you can see how you qualify for that. And when I say how you qualify for it, it really is for the visa. I'm not talking about what the US employer requires. So the US employer may require 10 years of experience. That is completely independent of the TN visa. So to take an example, if you're coming to the US to work as an economist and what the employer requires is 10 years of experience as an economist, that is not going to be relevant for you getting the visa. For the visa, you need to look at the regulations, which say that for an economist, you need a bachelor's degree. So in your TN application, you would make it clear that you are qualifying for the visa as an economist based on a bachelor's degree, not based on your experience. Now, you must have a pre-arranged job offer in the United States. So the TN visa is not a visa that allows you to come to the US to look for a job. You actually do need to have a job offer in hand. Uh, and as I mentioned, that job offer needs to have you working in one of the listed professions that you're qualified to work in, based again on the TN regulations. And finally, you see this final bullet in the job that you're coming to the US to perform, you must be employed to engage in professional activities consistent with that profession. So this is a very important aspect of the TN. And this is what that means. If you're coming to the US to work, say, as an economist, you need to be performing the job duties that the government thinks an economist performs. As an example, an economist is not a marketer. So if you have a job offer in the US and the US company says, we want to hire you as an economist, and basically what you're going to do for us is you are going to develop our social media presence. That's going to be a problem because the government does not think that what economists primarily do is marketing. How do you know what the government thinks a certain profession does? The answer is a resource that is online. And if you are at your computer, I recommend you look it up. It's called the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or OOH for short. So as an example, we can Google OOH accountant. If you're at your computer, I recommend you do that. And I'm using accountant as an example just because it's the first occupation that comes up alphabetically. And as you pull up that page, OOH accountant, click the link, and then you'll see some tabs toward the top of the website. The second tab says what they do. So if you click on that, you'll see job duties actually listed out. So accountants examine financial statements, compute taxes, inspect account books, organize, analyze, and maintain financial records, etc. So you do want to make sure if you're coming to the US to work as an accountant that the job duties you'll be performing are consistent with what is on the OOH website for that profession. I mentioned economists before. We will talk more about the economist category because it is one of the two especially challenging categories. So we won't look up those job duties just yet. We'll look those up in a later slide. But these are the basic TN requirements. So just run through them again. You need to have a passport from Canada or Mexico. You need to have a job offer in the US. That job offer needs to be for you to work in one of the listed TN professions and actually performing those job duties for that profession. And you need to have the qualification for that profession as defined in the TN regulations. One of the most common questions that we get at our firm is does a TN visa require sponsorship? And the answer depends on what your definition of sponsorship is. Um, our general answer is that no, a TN visa does not require sponsorship. And the reason for that is the way that sponsorship is defined in US immigration law is quite burdensome. To take an example, what sponsorship usually means is what's required, say, in the H-1B visa context or even in an employment-based green card context. So that usually requires that the US employer actually post the job to the public and see if there's a US citizen or a US worker who's available and able to perform the job. They need to pay a prevailing wage, which is usually higher than the minimum wage. The employer, if sponsoring the worker, needs to make sure that the employee is actually actively engaged in working and it's not what's called benched. If the employment is terminated, then the employer sometimes needs to pay for their transportation back home. So that is sponsorship. That's what sponsorship requires of the US employer. The TN requires none of that. And that is why we try to make it very clear that the TN visa does not require sponsorship in the way it is understood in US immigration law. What does the TN require? Essentially, the TN requires that the employer sign a letter that explains the terms of employment. So it talks about what the position in the US will be, what the pay will be, how long they intend to employ the foreign worker. Um, how much they intend to pay them. And it also talks about who the US employer is and their need for someone in that position. So um, this letter, we call it a TN employer letter. It it really is, it is not the same as a job offer. So you may have a separate job offer and contract, have a separate job posting. That's not the TN employer letter. The TN employer letter really is specifically written for the US Customs and Border Protection agent or the consular officer. And it actually is listing out how the company and the applicant satisfy the TN requirements. The employer would sign that letter, would write that letter, would sign that letter, and generally speaking, that is the only requirement on the employer. That letter is, generally speaking, not an enforceable contract. It is important that the employer be honest and be accurate in that letter. So if they say we intend to employ this person for 3 years and to pay them $100,000 a year, that should be their intention. However, generally TN employees are at will. So if it turns out that the employee uh, is not, meeting the job requirements, it's okay if they are terminated within that 3-year period. If the employee decides to quit, they have the freedom to quit. So generally speaking, it is fine if they are at will employees. Of course, if they do quit, if they are fired, they would lose their TN status. They would need to leave. But point being that the responsibility on the employer is fairly minimal when we're talking about a TN visa. A slight distinction is if the TN applicant is within the United States and is applying to change their status to TN status, then in addition to the TN letter that the employer would provide, the employer would also be the one that signs and files the form I-129, which is the application for a change of status to TN status. So that is an additional responsibility on the employer if the employee is in the US, but that form does not create additional requirements or responsibilities beyond those that we've already talked about. So the employee would still be at will. There would still be no requirement to test the labor market, to pay a prevailing wage, anything like that. All right, so let's go into some of the differences between the application process for Canadians and Mexicans. So let's talk about options that are available to nationals of Mexico. I think it's generally speaking easier to talk about nationals of Mexico because they have fewer options than nationals of Canada. So nationals of Mexico really have two options to apply for a TN visa. The first is if they are outside the US, they must apply at a consulate abroad. So to do that, they will submit a DS-160. It's an online application that's submitted to the consulate. The consulate will reach out to them to schedule biometrics, fingerprints, photographs, and then schedule the interview, the visa interview. The applicant would go to their visa interview and, if approved, would submit their passport, receive it back after a few days generally, and have the TN visa in their passport. At that point, they can then enter the US. And as soon as they enter, they'd have TN status and can start working for the TN employer. That is if someone is a national of Mexico and is outside the US. If someone is a national of Mexico and inside the US, they can apply at a consulate abroad, or they can apply through USCIS from within the US. And this is what I mentioned briefly during the prior slide, which is the US employer would file the I-129 on behalf of the employee. That application would go to USCIS. Um, in terms of timing, it generally does take several months for an I-129 to be decided. However, there is an option to expedite that. It's called premium processing. I think the current fee for that is about $2,800, so it is not cheap. But if you do pay that, then you get a decision within 15 business days. So that is a significant shortening of the time compared to not choosing premium processing. So the two options available to nationals of Mexico are apply at a consulate or apply within the US. And that latter option they can only do if they are already in the US. Nationals of Canada have a third option, which is a hugely beneficial option. Almost all Canadians do this because it is just so easy, which is that they can apply at a port of entry. That means either an airport or a land crossing. So nationals of Canada can simply leave the US, or if they're already outside the US, they would approach either a land crossing or an airport with their TN application. We'll talk about what a TN application includes in a few slides. And they would explain to the border officer that they intend to work for a US employer in TN status, provide their materials, and if approved, they would get a stamp, an entry stamp, and be admitted into the US. And once they're admitted, they can start working for that TN employer. So again, very quick process, relatively inexpensive process. Um, Canadians, when they enter the US, they are generally granted TN status for 3 years, and that's the same for nationals of Mexico. Really, anyone who's entering the US in TN status is granted 3 years of status, unless their employment is for a shorter period. So if the job in the US, say, is for a 1 year period, then that's the period of status that they would be given. And that would be shown on the I-94. The I-94 is the document that is created for anyone who's entering the US, whether they're TN or not. So someone entering would check their I-94, and generally they would see they have 3 years of TN status. Um, Spouses and children, what do they do if say the mother or father is given TN status, then the spouse would be eligible for TD status. So and that is the same for children. So the children and spouses of a TN recipient are eligible in general for TD status. That allows them to come into the US, and that allows them to study. That does not allow them to work. So if a spouse of a TN visa holder wants to work, then they would need to find their own work visa option. So that could be them applying for their own TN, or if there's another good visa option for them, like an E2, they would need to apply for that. But if they don't intend to work, they can enter on the TD and simply study or simply reside in the US with the principal. So I mentioned before there are a couple TN categories that are particularly challenging. Not impossible, but they just require strategy in a way that other professions don't. So again, these are two professional categories among the dozens that I mentioned before. So when you pull up the TN regulations, the two that are particularly challenging are management consultant and economist. And there are very different reasons why these are challenging. So let's start with management consultants. The reason that this is a challenging category is it is one of the very few TN occupational categories that does not require a degree. So if you didn't go to college, if you don't have a bachelor's degree, uh, this is one of, I think, two professional categories that you might be able to qualify for. So the government knows that if someone is applying for a TN and they don't have a bachelor's degree, they are by default many times going to apply as management consultants, regardless of whether they're actually coming to work as a management consultant. So the government will scrutinize these applications. Um, so what do you need to qualify? If you can qualify based on a bachelor's degree, but if you don't have a bachelor's degree, you can qualify based on 5 years of experience either as a management consultant or in a field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. So that second part really does open the door to a wide variety of roles. So I'll provide an example in a moment, but before I do, I want to make it clear that not all management consultant applications are challenging. The ones that are not challenging are if someone is coming to the US to work at a management consulting firm. So if you are a national, say, of Mexico, and you have been working at McKinsey in Mexico City, and McKinsey wants to send you to the United States to work at their New York office for a client in the United States, and you have 5 years of experience as a management consultant, that is not a risky application. Why? Because you are coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm. It's a fairly straightforward application. Um, what is challenging is if you're coming to the US to work for a company that is not a management consulting firm. So the example I like to use is, let's say that someone is a national of Mexico and has a decade of experience working in the solar panel industry. They are experts on solar panels, on the design of them, on the manufacturing of them, and a US company wants to hire this person to advise them. The US company, it manufactures and sells solar panels. So the US company wants to hire this national of Mexico to come to the US and advise them on how to improve their manufacturing and their sales of solar panels. So clearly, the company is not a management consulting company. It is a solar panel company. The person who's coming to the US is not a management consultant. They are an expert in solar panels. That is the kind of application that would be uniquely challenging. And again, that does not mean it's impossible. It just is, it has a higher risk of denial. It has a higher level of scrutiny when you submit the application. So how would you strengthen that application? In general, what you would want to do is you would want to structure the application so that it is clear to the government official that this really does look like a consulting agreement, a consulting arrangement. So what does that look like? In general, consultants, let's go back to our McKinsey example. Consultants are put on projects temporarily, and they are put on projects to address a very specific challenge. So McKinsey is not hired to come in and fill a permanent role at a company and be put on payroll and receive compensation as a W-2 employee at a client company, right? They are basically sent by McKinsey to come in, drop in, study a problem, make recommendations on a problem, and then they leave. And that's how you want to structure this arrangement if you're coming to the US to work for a company that's not a management consulting firm. So, in our example, some ways to strengthen that application would be, let's say that the US company, they would want to specifically define the challenge that they're facing. So we are struggling to reduce the costs of our manufacturing process, and we need this national from Mexico to come in and help us with that challenge. That challenge doesn't require 3 years. It only requires a year. So a more finite period of time, not asking for the full 3 years, asking for a shorter time. Having a consulting agreement in place. So that actually lists out here are the deliverables in months 1 through 3. This consultant is going to study the problem. In months 4 through 6, they're going to make recommendations. And in months 7 through 9, they're going to actually be observing the implementation of their recommendations, something like that. And their compensation is going to be based on those deliverables. So they're going to give us a report. They're going to spend X number of hours meeting with management at our US company, and they're going to be paid according to that. So that starts to look a lot more like a traditional consulting arrangement. And when the government official looks at that, they're going to say, this does sound familiar to me. This actually does look like what a management consultant would do. Contrast that with if the solar panel company were saying, you know what, we want this national of Mexico to join our company in a permanent role. We're going to put them on our payroll as a W-2 employee, full-time employee. We don't have a consulting agreement. That looks more like full-time employment, and that is a problem. So the term the government uses is that the management consulting role needs to be supernumerary. That is a fancy word for basically an extra role that's beyond the U.S. company's standard position. So again, think about it as a management consultant. It's a management consultant. You don't have a full-time management consultant role at your company generally. It's someone who's hired from outside, drops in, makes recommendations, and then leaves. So as you can tell, the management consultant TN application really does benefit from uh, legal advice. So this is an area where we do generally recommend contact a law firm. We, of course, are happy to help you navigate this process because management consultant applications can be complex. The second uniquely challenging category is that of economist. And it's challenging for completely different reasons, specifically that uh, and I do see a question. This webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to access this on our YouTube channel. So thank you for asking that question. The economist role is challenging because in 2017, the U.S. government put out a policy memo that specifically narrowed the scope of what an economist does. And I promised you before that we would look at those job duties. So if we Google OOH economist and pull up that page, economist, and then click the tab at the top that says what they do, you see here what the US government thinks economists do. So economists research economic issues, they conduct surveys, collect data, they analyze that data using mathematical models, statistics, they interpret and forecast trends, they advise businesses, governments, and individuals on economic or fiscal problems, and they present their research. And it goes on. I'm not going to read the entire page. You can see it on the Occupational Outlook Handbook website. This is what the government thinks economists do. So, what does the government think economists do not do? Economists do not work as financial analysts or market research analysts. So again, when I say economists don't do this, I'm talking purely in the sphere of TN applications. This is what the US government, both consular officers and border protection officers, they do not consider financial analysts or market research analysts to be working as economists. So if you have a job offer in the US to work as a financial analyst, then you're going to have a very hard time getting a TN visa because the only category you might fall within, the closest category, is going to be economists. And then when you submit that application, the government officer is going to say financial analysts are excluded from economists. So you're going to have to find some other way to perform that work, either through a different visa, potentially as a management consultant, if the role is actually aligned with the management consultant role. So let's talk about what financial analysts do and market research analysts. Financial analysts, and again, these are the two groups of people who are excluded from the economist category. Financial analysts in general are hired to find opportunities for their employer to make profit off of investments. So they may work at an investment bank or at a hedge fund, and they are looking for ways to invest funds to turn a profit. So again, if that is what you're doing in the US, you're going to have a hard time getting a TN visa. Market research analysts, they're really looking at how to improve the marketing of their employer. So they also would be excluded. So if your job duties are primarily focused on marketing, that is a real risk to the application. So again, if you fall into those two categories, you might need to look at a different visa. It could be an H-1B. It could be, say, an L-1 if it's appropriate. But a TN is probably going to be challenging. You might be able to frame it as a management consultant application, but again, you do need to make sure you're performing the job duties of a management consultant. And while I'm on that note, I realize that I didn't mention before, one of the requirements for the management consultant is you do need to align your job duties with the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So that applies to any TN job, as we talked about at the beginning. Um, so if we look at they're called management analysts, click on what they do on the OOH, and you see gather and organize information, interview personnel, analyze financial and other data, develop solutions, recommend the implementation of those solutions to management. So again, when I was using my solar panel expert example, this is exactly what that individual would have been doing, looking at the manufacturing process, analyzing it, analyzing the expenses, making recommendations, meeting with management. So you do want to make sure if you're applying in that management consulting category that your job duties are aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook for management analysts. So the TN application process, we already talked about this when we were talking about differences between Canadians and Mexicans who are applying. But in general, um, Canadians applying at a port of entry, what is the process? As I mentioned before, very straightforward. You're going to bring the application with you to the airport or to the land crossing. That application, uh, and by the way, what I'm about to say applies also to nationals of Mexico applying at a consulate or at USCIS. So the TN application packet in general consists of the same thing, whether you're applying at a port of entry or a consulate. And it is the job offer letter. So I should say the TN employer letter. So again, that is a letter signed by the employer that details how the US company qualifies for the TN, meaning it's a US employer, very low bar to meet that requirement, and how the applicant satisfies the requirements. So they are qualified to work in the profession. They're going to be performing certain job duties that are consistent with the profession, etc. What they're going to be paid, how long they're going to work for. That's what the TN employer letter will contain. Supporting documentation. So that is going to prove their citizenship, that they're a citizen of Canada or Mexico, that they qualify. So that could be based on their educational background or that they have a professional license, if again the profession allows that, according to the TN regulations, or their experience. So let's say you're applying as a management consultant and you're qualifying based on experience, you do need to have actual letters signed, handwritten signature, original signature, um, from past employers talking about how you do have at least 5 years of experience. So that is going to be the supporting documentation that you see here on your screen. Some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. You can find this on the US Customs and Border Protection website. And in general, it's always a good idea to call ahead to the port of entry just to make sure you're aware of the process. If you're applying at a consulate, you are going to prepare the same packet of information. So that letter from the employer, as well as the documents proving that you qualify and that you are a citizen of Canada or Mexico. But in addition to that, you're going to file a DS-160, which is an online application. It goes to the consulate and is reviewed by them, and then they call you in for an interview. You may be able to renew the visa by mail. The consulate will let you know if you qualify for that. And finally, if you're within the US, whether you're a national of Canada or Mexico, you can apply through USCIS. The employer, again, would submit that form and would sign it. The application packet is going to be the same, except you would not submit originals. So USCIS takes copies, and you would need to submit, the employer would need to submit the form for that application, the I-129. So within the US through USCIS, you have to file the I-129. At a consulate, you have to file the DS-160. And at a port of entry, you don't have any form. You really just have your packet of supporting documentation and the employer letter. So let's talk about some tips and common pitfalls. As I mentioned, it's always a good idea to call ahead to the port of entry before you arrive, especially during COVID. Ports of entry would change their hours, would limit the number of people who could go in because of the size of waiting rooms. So it's always a good idea to call. Make sure you understand the hours the port is going to be open and if there are any unique procedures for TN applicants. It's a good idea to ensure that your employer contact, meaning the person who signed that employer letter, that's part of your application, is available when you plan to approach the border or go to the consulate. So sometimes the government official will actually call that person during the interview. And really, the point is just to make sure that the job offer is legitimate. Keep in mind, consular officers and border officers do encounter a lot of fraud, fake documents, fake job offers. So they are very skeptical. So this is why you always want to bring original documents and have that person who signed that letter available by phone. You can just tell them, I'm planning to approach the border sometime between 3 and 5 tomorrow. Could you just have your phone on you? And because if they do get that quick call, that's just confirming that the job offer exists and the position exists, you want to make sure someone's there to answer that phone call. As I mentioned, original documentation is key if you're applying at a border or at a consulate. So if you're qualifying based on your education, bring your diploma, original diploma. If you are getting into your transcripts and specific courses that you took, bring a certified copy of your transcript. The letter from the employer needs to have an original signature on it. It needs to be printed on the employer's official letterhead. So again, government officers encounter a lot of fraud. So these are ways that you can kind of make it clear to them this is not fraudulent, completely legitimate, with the original documentation to back that up. Um, and remember, finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. So what does that mean? It's not a green card. So that means you do need to be prepared to leave at the end of your TN status. This usually is not an issue if you are on your first TN, your second TN. If you've been in the US, say 8, 9, 10 years, and you're renewing it, you've renewed it a few times, then you might start getting questions about, do you actually intend to leave at the end of this? So for that reason, it can be wise to include in your application proof that you have ties abroad. So copies of your bank statements abroad, if you have property abroad, if you have family, just proof that you do have those ties abroad and you plan to leave. A few side notes since we do have time, and if you have questions, please feel free to send those in. We do have a few more minutes. I wanted to touch on a few things. The first is I mentioned transcripts. Why would you need a transcript? If you're applying as an economist and you have a degree in economics, you probably don't need a transcript. But what if you're applying as an economist and you have a degree in math or a degree in English? Then you see how there is a spectrum. Having a degree in economics, applying as an economist, very clear, very clearly related. Having a degree in math, applying as an economist, is related, clearly related, but riskier than having a degree in economics. So in that case, if your degree is in math, you would want to bring your transcript and you would want to show that you've actually taken classes in economics. If you've done independent research, while getting that degree, if you wrote a thesis in economics, then you want to use all those things to show that your bachelor's degree did equip you to work as an economist. So it is important that your degree be related, excuse me, to the job that you're coming to the US to perform. And if it is not closely related, such as if your degree is in English and you're applying as an economist, you are facing a high likelihood of denial. The government does want to see that the degree is related. So if you have a degree in English, you're applying as an economist, hopefully you have significant coursework, maybe as a minor. Maybe you got a minor in economics, but otherwise, that is likely going to be a very challenging application, and you may have to look at other visa options for that. Um, but the degree should be identical to or related to the job in the US. And you can use the Occupational Outlook Handbook for this point. So um, as an example, see if I can remember which category is explicit about this. If we go to um, okay, good. So sometimes if you go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook, then uh, let's take economist as an example, since I've been talking about that. So if you Google OOH economist, and instead of clicking the tab what they do, you click the tab how to become one. There's a subcategory called education, a heading called education. And it says there, candidates who have a bachelor's degree with sufficient course credits in economics, statistics, or math may qualify for some entry-level economist positions. So that's the kind of language that, let's say that you have that degree in English, you're applying, you have a job offer to work as an economist, and you have taken courses in economics, statistics, or math. You can quote this language from the Occupational Outlook Handbook and make the best argument you can and bring your transcript, highlight those courses you took, emphasize those courses in the employer letter. To say, even though my degree is in English, I did take coursework that prepared me for this job. So just strategies to strengthen an application if the degree is not clearly related. And a couple other side notes, you can get a TN to work part-time. So you do not have to work full-time on a TN. Related to that, you can have TN approval to work for more than one employer. So let's say you get an offer to work as a part-time economist for one company and as a part-time economist to work for another. You can work for both as long as you have TN approval for both. So you do need to wait until the government approves that application, either at the border, at a consulate, or USCIS. Once you do have that approval, though, you can work for the companies that you have approval for. So even if it is more than one. So I don't believe any questions have rolled in. So I am going to go ahead and wrap this up. Please do keep an eye out for the email that Jelena mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. We hope to see you on future webinars. Check out our YouTube channel. We try to put great information out there for free. If you do want to talk about the circumstances of your case and your application, our website has a link. It's very easy to schedule a 30-minute consultation or an hour-long consultation at a time that works for you, and we'd be happy to talk through the specifics of your situation. So thank you for taking the time. We really do hope to see you on future webinars. Stay well in the meantime. And Jelena, thank you so much.